Hello, everybody. Very welcome to the webinar, Nagorno-Karabakh, from status quo towards final resolution, ? Organized by the research platform Russia and the Caucasus Regional Research, RUCARR, at Malmö University in Sweden. I'm Carina Wamling, Professor of Caucasus Studies and co-director of RUCARR, together with my colleague, Professor Bo Pettersson. We would like to wish our panelists a very warm welcome, and of course to thank you all for agreeing to participate in this panel discussion. Our distinguished panel includes 4 experts with different backgrounds and expertise. So we will be very honored to have on our panel Professor Gerard Libaridian, Dr. Philip Gamaghelyan, Dr. Kamal Makili-Aliyev, and Mr. Zaur Shiriyev. I don't know if I pronounced your names correctly. Apologies for that. I will now, in a minute, hand over to our moderator today. So welcome, Dr. Julie George, and also thank you so much for taking on the task of being our moderator today. So Dr. Julie George is Associate Professor at Queen's College, City University of New York. And in her research, she is working on ethnic politics, state building, democratization in the post-Soviet space. So we will be in very good hands. Julie, the floor is yours, and thank you again so much.
Thank you so much, and it's such an honor to be invited. I really appreciate it. I think that we have a number of people, about 300 people who signed up to be in this. So I think we should go forward with the content of our presentation today and listen to our speakers and their opinions. The focus here is not on the longer contours of the conflict, but really on the most recent events in Nagorno-Karabakh, the preconditions for the most recent resurgence of violence in the area, conditions of the ceasefire, and the opinions that our panelists have on the ceasefire, and any anticipated predictions about how they see events unfolding in the area. I will be moderating the Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. But keep in mind that I will be restricting the kinds of questions that I give to our moderators or give to our panelists in our discussion on these particular salient points. So we've asked everyone to restrict their commentary to these immediate matters. Our first speaker today is Professor Gerard Libaridian. He is a professor of history, professor emeritus of history at the University of Michigan, and he is the former advisor to the first president of Armenia on foreign and security policies. Professor Libaridian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for having created this occasion. I would like to structure my talk on the basis of the 4 questions that had been asked by Professor Kamal, and whether the war was inevitable is the first question. My answer to the question is very simple. Yes, it was avoidable, and yet it was not avoided because of the positions of the 2 parties. That is, the Armenian side has been trying to extend the status quo that was created after 1994, and this was unacceptable to Azerbaijan. It's as simple as that. And for 20 years, the last 20 years, there have been negotiations of different for about different kinds of solutions, but no solution. I think one major reason I can mention here is that the parties to the conflict really never, not in the last 20 years, defined their minimum. Each functioned on the basis of what they want and what is the maximum. And so when negotiations happen and you start coming to an agreement, one side or the other, and would kind of withdraw, saying, well, if I got this much, I can get more. Now, there's a fundamental difference between the two positions in the following sense. The Azerbaijani side is looking at the conflict as one of territory. The Armenian side looks at it as the problem of a people on a historic homeland and their right to live freely and securely. So these are very different perceptions of the problem, and that's why it has been one of the reasons why it's been very difficult to get there. Now, in the last 2.5 years, it was very obvious, the last 2.5 years from the Armenian point of view, that the new leader of Armenia, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, wanted to approach the issue very differently and to start where it was the most difficult, and that was the status, the future final status of Karabakh. Usually this issue had been tried, it hadn't succeeded, there was no way the two sides could agree now, and usually it was postponed for a later time, at least that was seen as the problem. But there was the question of the 7 districts which were occupied by the Armenian forces for security reasons, and later seen as something of a negotiating chip, and later by some on the Armenian side as liberated territories, having belonged to Armenians long time ago. Now, in the last 2.5 years, Nikol Pashinyan tried something else to start from the most difficult part, and that made it very difficult for the Azerbaijanis to accept, while Azerbaijanis throughout this period have been saying, look, we will get those back and we'll wait for the right occasion and we'll get when we are ready militarily. And that is where things went. The Armenian side miscalculated in terms of the power relations. At the same time, the Turkish involvement added to the capabilities of Azerbaijan. It had always been there, but now it became much more serious. And so a more confident Azerbaijan decided that there's no hope of getting to a solution on the Armenian side, and that's how the war started. Now, the second question that was asked is, how is this ceasefire different from the 1994 ceasefire? In the 1994 phase of this war, it was the Armenian side that had won, and this time it is the Azerbaijani side that has won. Now, what is different between these two agreements, two ceasefire documents? One is that in the first ceasefire, and for some time after that, the Karabakh Armenian government was part of the negotiations. The agreement, the ceasefire agreement was signed by Karabakh at that time, and this time it wasn't. That is, Karabakh was left out and Armenia had to assume responsibility for all that was on the Armenian side. And this is a very important distinction. We may want to develop that further. Secondly, in the 94 agreement, there was Armenian control over the 7 districts in question outside of Karabakh. In the agreement signed a few weeks ago, the 7 districts had, 4 of them had already passed to the Azerbaijani side, more or less 4, because of the military operations, and the 3 as a condition for the ceasefire. So these were no longer in play. A very important distinction is that the 94 agreement did not decide on the status. It said that the status would be decided later, along with the control of the Lachin corridor. So according to the 94 agreement, Lachin stayed under Armenian control, and the status was to be negotiated after that. That is, the rest of the problems would be negotiated after the ceasefire. In the current ceasefire, Lachin goes, as I read it, under Azerbaijani sovereignty, but under Russian peacekeeping forces' control. So this is a somewhat different understanding, and it changes the potential for future possibilities. Then there's the question of the status. There is no direct article in the ceasefire agreement or sentence that decides on the status. It says that it will be discussed in the future, it will be negotiated. But assuming the assumptions under many of the statements, and subsequently the statements of President Putin of Russia as a mediator, the question was settled as far as he's concerned, and certainly as far as Azerbaijan is concerned, that whatever is to be negotiated as status is not between, let's say, independence for Karabakh versus being part of Azerbaijan, or being part of Armenia versus being part of Azerbaijan. The negotiations appear to be now limited in terms of the future status to whatever can be managed, accepted, negotiated as part of Azerbaijan. At least that's my reading, and that's the reading internationally, I believe. Although Armenia now is saying that no, that's not what it means, but I think that's what it means de facto. The other difference is that in the 1994 agreements, the ceasefire, the Minsk group chairmanship was quite active in the form of the Swedes and in general, the other members of the Minsk group. In the current ceasefire, the mediator is Russia. The others are supporting the effort, but it is Russian. It was a Russian ceasefire agreement. It is Russia that sent its peacekeeping forces. And in general, we see that the role of the US and France as co-chairman with Russia of the Minsk group, that role for France and US has diminished. The other day, when President Putin called a meeting of the principals within his own government to discuss this issue, Foreign Minister Lavrov specified that this the Minsk group is active, the Minsk group is important, and the Minsk group responsibilities now while Russia is leading the effort, France and US can help by assuring that there's international assistance to do the rebuilding effort, which is a far less significant role than what it had been. I don't think France and Russia, France and the US will be able to do much more than what Russia allows at this point. And finally, I think there's the big difference is that in the 1994 agreement, Turkey was not present, except indirectly as a member of the Minsk group. While in this case, the ceasefire agreement does not mention Turkey directly, but we know that Turkey has become much more important. In fact, Turkey has replaced now the France and US as the major player. And therefore, as a consequence, we can see that now the major players are Russia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And This was not the case in 1994. Now, there are, I'm sorry, how much time do I have left, Julie? 1 minute? Well, let me stop here and then I can develop further because that's another segment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Libaridian. Our next speaker is Mr. Zaur Shiriyev. He is the International Crisis Group's analyst for the South Caucasus and was part of the Chatham House. He was a research associate at Chatham House for Russia and Eurasia. His internet is spotty, so be patient with us as we get him going. If he comes out, don't worry, he'll come back in, but it's back and forth.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you to all. And actually, I would like to start with a small disclaimer that what I'm going to tell is that not a position of the crisis group, or it's not. It's my own personal views. When Mr. Libaridian spoke today, it reminded me something. I think it's reminded me 8 years ago when I was a young researcher, and Mr. Libaridian warned us the danger of the war and need for peaceful resolution. And when I made the similar points, one of the participants looked at me and said that I'm afraid you will repeat the same things until your hair turns white, like Libaridian. But of course, today there is a different picture. The old status quo has disappeared, and the new realities have emerged. I'm going to answer the questions that were posed by the moderator. The first question is about whether the war was inevitable or not. I think that the first indicators that war was coming came with the debate between the Azerbaijan and Armenia leaders at the Munich meeting in February. And the debate also indicated that all of the progress since the 2018 was essentially lost, like the communication channel and work on the preparation for population to the peace. And all trust in negotiation was already gone in Baku. But the clash on the Azerbaijan-Armenian international border in July were the announcement of another war. Unlike the April 2016, the element of surprise was not expected in the next war, and it was thought that this war would be similar to 2016. Even this war was pre-named April Plus. At this point, I think the international mediators did not read the dynamics in Azerbaijan correctly. At a large rally for the first time in July, people's demands were forgotten as authentic, and they read this fact as an element of the propaganda. Sometimes there are those who think that the settlement of the Karabakh conflict was not a priority for Azerbaijan, and this was due to the ignorance about the depths and dynamics of the conflict and its impact in Azerbaijani society. And also, another problem was that the fundamental problem was about the lack of negotiation. And for many years, I think the mediators have been trying only to prevent the war by just showing that the sides are discussing and negotiating. But in reality, nothing fundamental has been discussed in the last 30 years. They failed to see that how this unfruitful the talks increased appetite for war in Baku. And if the focus had been on preventing war, that should be the shaping the peace, not only the looking for how to prevent the war. And the second part is that the question is posed is that what has changed? I think that the previous talks were based on the philosophy that Azerbaijan must accept the consequences of the defeat in a war and make a bigger compromise, especially with regard to the future status of Nagorno-Karabakh. I think the biggest change is that Azerbaijan has reclaimed the strategic, the Shusha and other territories in the former Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, and has also gained an advantage in future status negotiation. And also today's ceasefire agreement has made some differences with with one signed in 1994. I think the first is interstate nature and has signatures of the country's leaders, and second, there's no signature from the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, and because Armenia wanted to have the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians at the negotiation table on the basis of their signature as a conflict's interested party in 1994. And This ceasefire today, I think that creates a new chance and also the new risk. I think that's uh, unlike the first the war. I think Azerbaijan has achieved a military victory, but Baku has more opportunities to turn this military victory into a peaceful the solution. But what is important here, I think, the stability in Yerevan and how Yerevan reacts to the new reality. If you look this agreement or trilateral statement, and I don't know how we are going to call it, using the Weimar logic, this will only strengthen the feelings of revanchism. But if we look at this logic of the Dayton, I think we can say that enmity between the two countries will disappear in the short and medium term, and the steps will be taken to resolve the conflict. And also, if you are looking to the solution in the future, we should solution must be with those people, and how we are going to convince them that if you are not talking to them, and how we are going to make them generation different and more friendly to Azerbaijan. This is something that we have to consider. The political forces has to consider in Azerbaijan. People under 30, for example, among the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenia, do not remember that Karabakh being within Azerbaijan. And this is very hurtful to hear maybe, but that is the case. And that's a part of the reality that we will need to deal with in the future. But there is also good the sign that the construction of the transport corridors and opening of the communication channels in the agreement will help to eliminate hostility in the future. Previously, it was unclear how the alternative to the status quo for people would be peace. That's the status quo continues, and for them, the benefit of the peace were not seen or felt. But economic opportunities can make that happen and make a big difference. Of course, there will be a big tax for Azerbaijan in the future, in the coming the months and years. Is that about this the return of the IDPs to their homes, and also how to rebuilding this the territories. And also one of the things that might be there is a lack of the Western engagement in the ending the war, but there is also opportunity for Western countries to rebuilding this the 7 adjacent territories, also Nagorno-Karabakh itself. And I think that's when the Western countries will be ready, there will be plenty of room them to help. International donors such as the EU, World Bank, and individual countries could provide significant financial support to the entire region. And so there are questions about the identity of the mediators and how they're going to deal if they will be the future of the talks. I think the first question will be how we are going to continue the talks on the similar format. I think in particular, I think right now the Western countries have made it priority to find the ways to keep Turkey out of the process, rather than thinking about how they can take part in the next talks and what contribution they can make. Understanding in Baku is that the Western countries need to rid themselves of suspicion of the what Turkey and Russia could be up for. Their initiatives did not produce any results in the last 25 years. And so that's why there should be some reform in the mediation process. And and also there should be a more roadmap for the future the talks. But I would like to add two the small issues which is very important. One is that about I talked briefly about the return of IDPs. I think that they will face 2 issues. First of all, the mining and also stability, and also the environment that they can turn the back, but it will take the years, and it might be also it might also increase the appetite that when they are going to return back. So then, so that's why this is going to be a big issue financially, structurally. So that then I think the International Donor Conference and others needs to involve in this process. And one last point, I think that I think that the conflict sides should ground their future talks in reality rather than illusory expectation or demobilization of the other. Especially in the recent days, we saw that some of the violation of the many videos that shows the violation of the Geneva Convention, and it also it is only increased the hatred, and that's why one of the priority in the coming months might be to find a way to investigate the violation by both sides. And I don't want to make a what aboutism here that one and both sides are doing, but we saw recently the many videos that actually makes also Azerbaijani society unhappy, and this should be the case, and serious investigation and condemnation, and because this is not the face that we would like to show the Armenians if you are looking for to live together in the future. I'm done. So I think that I skip out of another question that what future holds, but we will have a discussion in the future. So there will be special questions.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Shiriyev. What I would like to take a moment to invite our attendees to notice the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom, so that if you have any questions that you'd like to add, the questions come to me, and then I will, in our Q&A process, I will kind of combine them together so that we can have a kind of constructive, coherent, kind of broad-based Q&A, and then I will ask the questions, maybe reword a few to the panelists. So please take advantage of that. I am monitoring it. I have a list already that I'm compiling for after our presenters speak. Our next presenter is Dr. Philip Gamaghelyan, the assistant professor at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego. Philip, you have the floor.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for the invitation. And I want to apologize in advance for dropping out a bit before the end of the Q&A session. As I told you, I had multi-motive engagement. So I'll try to follow the same sequence of the three questions that were posed to us and start from the one whether war was inevitable. But quickly, a quick note prior to that about the winners and losers. We in the region tend to think of this conflict as a win-lose conflict, where one side loses and the other side wins. In the 90s, Armenians won, now Azerbaijanis won, and the other lost. And that is a correct view if we look at it in a very narrow kind of two-dimensional sense. But South Caucasus does not exist in a vacuum. And if we are to zoom out and look into the wider region and look into the world, what we can see are two small post-colonial countries that are bleeding each other out for 30 years now, and really dragging each other down to a point where we are once again standing at the verge of losing our sovereignty. And Armenia might be closer to the abyss at this point, but we are a small region and chained to each other, and really one domino falling is very likely to drag down after it also Azerbaijan and Georgia. I'll get to it a bit later again, but was the war inevitable? I think it was very much evitable. I think we could have avoided it. We did avoid it for a long time. And we like to blame oftentimes outside actors, particularly Russia, for not allowing us to find solution from benefiting from our conflict. And to a certain degree, in certain periods, that might have been correct. And yet that takes away the responsibility from us. And it obscures the fact that there were many periods throughout these 30 years when we could very much have one-on-one agree on a solution. The 90s were one such period, 2008, 2011, Medvedev's presidency were a second, when he made a very big push to help us solve the conflict, and we effectively refused. And the third period were 2018 and early 2019, soon after Pashinyan came to power. Why I think this was an opportunity to solve a conflict and why we didn't take it. I'll start from Armenia. Prior to 2018, Armenia was led by Serge Sarkisyan, who came to power through fraudulent elections and violence perpetrated against its own citizens. And Sarkisyan was a very unpopular leader who had little to zero legitimacy in Armenia, with one exception. He was known for being one of the leaders of Nagorno-Karabakh during the first victorious, so-called war of 1990s, and so he was also tough on Azerbaijan and non-compromising. So engaging in any serious negotiation and compromising with Azerbaijan would make him look weak and would remove this last pillar on which his presidency was based, and his presidency would collapse. At least that was, I assume, his calculation. The way the fate would have it, his presidency collapsed anyways, and in 2018 he was replaced by Nikol Pashinyan, who, unlike his predecessor, was extremely popular. If you remember, in 2018 his party received 80% of the vote, and that is quite an unprecedented popularity really for any post-Soviet leader. That would allow him, in principle, to engage in negotiations, agree on compromises, and because the people trusted in him, he could possibly talk to the Armenian population and to the Armenian society and explain why a compromise was necessary. That, of course, didn't happen. I'll get to it in a second. But across on the negotiation table, Pashinyan had President Ilham Aliyev, who spent the good part of his 17-year tenure really promoting hatred towards Armenians, promoting very negative attitudes towards Armenians, threatening Armenians, and threatening not only to take back Karabakh, but also in many of his speeches to invade Armenia and even Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. Then suddenly in 2018, he made a big U-turn. And after Pashinyan came to power, he extended a hand and offered to negotiate. That became publicly known after the 2018 meeting in Dushanbe, when Aliyev and Pashinyan talked directly and agreed to establish a direct contact. Why did President Aliyev do that? I would assume my colleagues Zaur and Kamal can tell more, maybe have better insights. In my understanding, there were two calculations. One was that the war was risky, and while it was very difficult to negotiate with Sarkisyan, and Sarkisyan probably could not deliver, it was likely possible to negotiate with Pashinyan, who was a popular leader, and get through negotiations a similar deal that he could get through a war, or maybe more. The second calculation, though, is important because we need to remember what was really the negotiation at the negotiation table at that moment. And that was the Lavrov plan, which was a version of Madrid principles, not particularly beneficial neither for Armenia nor for Azerbaijan. In this period, preceding 2018, when Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders could not really talk to each other, they were effectively negotiating in a proxy way through Moscow. And the price for that was that in addition to compromising with each other, they would also have to compromise with Russia and cede part of their sovereignty to Russia in exchange for helping them broker and maintain a peace deal. So I would assume that the calculation on President Aliyev's end at that point was that, yes, Russia would have to have a special role in any solution, and nobody could really walk away fully from the Lavrov plan at that point. But if there was a direct communication and positive relationship between the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan, they could maximize what Armenia and Azerbaijan jointly could get out of the deal. Why did the negotiation fail? On the Azerbaijani end, the responsibility, in my view, is in these 20, 30 years, and specifically the last 17 years of escalating with Armenia and creating an image of Azerbaijani and specifically of President Aliyev as very belligerent and intent of destroying Armenia. And because of that, his U-turn was seen with suspicion and was not really accepted in Armenia. Having said that, I see a very major responsibility, perhaps primary responsibility for the failure of the negotiations with Pashinyan and his team, who effectively refused to negotiate. And that is something Pashinyan himself has said a number of times now since November 9. Discussing why he didn't see a solution possible, but effectively walking away from any real document on a table, be it Madrid principles or Lavrov plan, and offering his own solutions, which were really outside of anything that has ever been negotiated. This was a major miscalculation, of course. Pashinyan and his team misjudged the international community's approach to this conflict, misjudged Russian position on this conflict, and misjudged Aliyev's extended hand on de-escalation in 2018, mistaking it for weakness and not understanding that the alternative to not negotiating is effectively a war that Armenia cannot win. So where are we now? I agree, of course, with the title of our event today, that the former status quo is gone. But I don't agree with the second part, that we are nearing any form of a solution. I believe we don't. In fact, I think we are in the most dangerous part of our conflict. The conflict was expanded, and from a two-party, realistically, Armenians versus Azerbaijanis conflict, has become a regional conflict with Russian troops on the ground and active involvement of Turkey. And if we have a further escalation, any next war will be already much more regional, will at least involve Russia and Turkey, but will also likely invite in further regional and global actors, such as Iran and the US. And while I'm not sure, and nobody is sure certainly what the outcome of such a new big war will be, it cannot be beneficial for neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan, two countries on whose territory the war will be waged and who have most to lose, and possibly including up to their sovereignty. Why I see a war very much possible? Right now, I don't see any attempts to de-escalate. The Azerbaijan seem to be pressing, at least rhetorically right now, in direction of reparations and putting further pressure on Armenia. And there are very strong revanchist voices in Armenia, starting from the current government and with the opposition parties led by the two former presidents of Sarkisyan and Kocharyan. And so there is a good possibility for escalation that again might result in a much further damage to Armenia and Azerbaijan. Having said that, I think we are at the crossroads, and it's also possible to go in the opposite direction and understand at this point, at least, that while we lost a lot of chances in the past, really the best chance forward as sovereign countries, as an independent region in the South Caucasus, is the direct contacts and direct communication. And I hear also voices in this regard, both in Azerbaijan and in Armenia, starting from our dear colleague Gerard Libaridian, as well as others associated with the former first president, Levon Ter-Petrosyan and his party. And if we are to go in direction of normalization, I think we should work in two directions. One is, and this is my last point, I see, Julie, that I have to wrap up. We should work in two directions. One is the obvious one, diplomatic establishment of diplomatic relations and economic re-engagement. But I'll also agree with Zaur Shiriyev that there is a whole second dimension of the conversation here. And I will call it transitional justice. I see a major need for engaging in transitional justice measures because the conflict, so starting from the 90s and continuing right now as we speak, a massive amount of war crimes that are, as well as a very hostile rhetoric and massive displacement of populations, which are all major issues that need to be addressed if we are to ever be able to coexist in the same region. And transitional justice has been really the mechanism of moving forward in that direction. I will also stop here and continue with Q&A session later.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very thoughtful. Our final speaker is Dr. Kamal Makili-Aliyev, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Global Political Studies at Malmö University. And he is the person who really put us together today and has been a central force behind this conversation. So we thank him very much for that. And then it's your turn to speak. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Julie. You're too kind. I would say that it's always very hard to deliver some kind of remarks or speech after the representatives that we have on the panel, because they pretty much covered a broader spectrum of events that led to the recent eruption of hostilities and what we have situation as of now on the ground. But then it also presents me with an opportunity to be a little bit selfish, as researchers sometimes are, and see if my ideas and my understanding of the questions that we're discussing is worthy and of a discussion. And I, of course, might have some conclusions a little bit different. So I would be really happy to hear the point of view of our panel and the questions about what I'm going to be talking right now. And without trying to repeat what previous speakers have already touched upon, I want to also touch about the inevitability of war. Just like Theo, I think that the war was inevitable. We could have avoided that scenario, but unfortunately, the circumstances led to a very different result. And I would say, if we're talking from Azerbaijani perspective, I think it was quite clear that for Azerbaijan, avoiding the war was very much important in several points, as Phil also mentioned. It seems risky. Yes, it is. It was very risky to engage in the war, and for a number of reasons for Azerbaijan. First and foremost, the wars are unpredictable. You cannot be 100% sure that it's going to go according to plan, and the result might be not in your favor militarily at any point. The geopolitical risks are also there, Russia and Iran, and they have been very tense during the eruption of recent hostilities. That can be proven by the fact that Iran moved military towards the border with Azerbaijan at some point. Russia had its forces ready and on the go, despite how it seemed. There's an evidence that from the day one, they have ready armed forces there. So the geopolitical risks are there. Political risks associated with the failure in the war efforts for Azerbaijan would be, and for its government would be quite consequential and very, very much disruptive and destructive. There are also social, economic costs, especially if we're thinking about the critical infrastructure and energy infrastructure that Azerbaijan has very close to the region where the hostilities erupted. So for Azerbaijan, avoiding the war scenario was actually very important. The fact is that for Azerbaijan, it was probably, and we can say that pretty surely, that it was a last resort kind of a situation. Why I would say that, and this last resort as understood by Azerbaijan and its government, for sure, it can be, of course, a matter of question if it was the last resort or not last resort situation, but that was the understanding at that time. And for me, it seemed when analyzing the situation before the eruption of hostilities and how the view formed in Armenia of the room that it has in its political and military actions, it seemed that there was kind of a consensus based on what the scholarship was discussing and what the publicists were discussing, what the media was discussing, that the red line lay in the non-recognition of the Nagorno-Karabakh as a separate state. Up to that, there was this kind of understanding or this kind of a consensus that up to that, there was a lot of flexibility of what Armenia could and couldn't do politically and militarily in the military sphere. And I think that view was very much proven wrong, because the red line, this perceived red line, it also has to be taken in what it was in essence, rhetorical, or in the political action that lies in the recognition of the state. So saying as a political action, it can be retracted. The rhetoric, and as Phil said, on part of Azerbaijan, the rhetoric changed in 2019, for example. Then it changed again, closer to the eruption of hostilities. In Armenia, the rhetoric changed several times during the progression of the conflict. And those things were quite understood from what they were, but the political interest, political leverage, political pressure changes and the rhetoric changes, and even the retraction of the recognition is theoretically possible. What you can do militarily, that is, of course, a very different question. And I think here, maybe I'm wrong, but I can even draw the point of no return. And that would be the fact that in a lot of discussions and in a lot of analysis is omitted is the killing of the Azerbaijan Major General of Azerbaijan Armed Forces during the escalation of the hostilities during the summer 2020. And that, for me, at least from my analysis, marked the point of no return, because that cannot be undone. And such a military move could not be undone. And if you would compare it just by anecdotal evidence with what happened between the United States and Iran, and there you would see the nervousness of the leadership of the nuclear superpower. But when it comes to the situation where you have Azerbaijan and Armenia, that same scenario could only provoke a military response. And from that point onwards, it was quite clear that there's going to be a serious military response, and it was going to be on a very, very large scale. We arrived to the situation where the status quo has changed, but the conflict remains unresolved. And the new ceasefire agreement that was reached, it also interests me very much as a scholar because of my legal background and my analysis that I do through international law. So I'm going to go a little bit in this sphere. For me, it's very important to understand what that agreement legally means, because we are rightfully calling it an agreement, and in most of the commentaries you would see it as an agreement. But as Zaur said, it's formally known as a statement, not even as an agreement. And you would hear that mostly from officials in Russia and in Russian language, that it's called a statement. So agreement in itself is not a peace treaty, and it might not become a treaty at all, because the treaty in international law, especially peace treaties, they require a process, a special process to be considered legally binding upon a state. At the same time, the agreement can become a legally binding and even a treaty given certain circumstances, but it's not always a given. When you are calling something a statement publicly, especially if you are one of the signatories to the document, and you're calling it a statement, that is lowering its legal relevance and consciously lowering its legal relevance. The question is, why would you do that? And we can speculate, but it of course is a little bit of worrying signs about how much legal consequences the violation of such a document that you're calling a statement is going to bring, if it's not even considered formally an agreement that the states feel that they're bound by. And the change in the status quo, it had a profound effect, of course, on the dynamics of the conflict and the continuation that we're going to see within the dynamics of the conflict. The agreement, the new agreement, had what the previous agreement didn't, and that is a sort of an enforcement mechanism in the form of Russian peacekeepers on the ground. And exactly the enforcement mechanism is also limited in time with 5-year period. So at least within this 5-year period, despite the involvement of regional powers much closely in the conflict and even in the territory of the conflict, it still has this temporal defense against the escalation of hostilities, if we take into account what we're talking about, the nuclear power standing behind it. In that kind of situation, the time is of the essence. The temporal effect of the agreement is of the essence. And that means that I agree with previous panelists that for Azerbaijan and Armenia, it is right now a high time to think about what kind of opportunities for the resolution this actually presents. And I would say, first and foremost, it's concentrating on the part of the agreement that opens the communications, and especially economic communications, that can be a very good leading line, this silver thread that they can pull on to make their positions closer on other different questions. A lot of things in the post-conflict situations and even the conflict resolution situations depend on the economy and the prosperity of the parties. And I think it's a very good point to discuss during this panel and further in our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kamal. And now I'd like to ask all of our panelists if you could turn on your videos. I have a number of different questions. We have about 55 questions currently in the Q&A. And so what I'm going to do is locate some commonalities in questions and kind of redesign them and rewrite them. I apologize to the people who are asking such excellent questions, but there are just so many to get through. So instead, I'm going to just repackage them. And Kamal, you were finishing on the conversation, a comment about economic viability. And there are a number of questions in the Q&A about the potentiality of the continued trade, maybe trade or opening trade between Turkey and Armenia, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I first want to ask you to talk a little bit more, because that's where you were ending, but then I'd also ask Philip to also comment on this. What are the potentialities for economic connections, trade connections being brought between some of the main actors where there's so much, there's been a lack of trade before. So Kamal first, and then Philip.
Thank you very much, Julie. I think there's a lot of responsibility that lies with Azerbaijan right now to be able to extend the hand to the Armenia, in the sense that try to be able to truly open the borders in the full sense, include the Armenia and Armenians into the economic opportunities that the region that is located in the crossroads provides. And of course, during all this time, from the beginning of the 90s, specifically it's 1993, Armenia have been in the semi-isolation due to the close borders with Azerbaijan and Turkey. The opening of the communication can actually affect very much the economic situation in Armenia, with the free-flowing trade and with the access to the larger communications, regional communications and beyond, open the ways to the high seas, connect Azerbaijan and Turkey also directly, which is a part of the agreement, and with that stimulate the people-to-people context, and then switching to the track two, which I think Philip and Zaur touched about briefly in the speeches, which is going to be very, very important for the future of two peoples if they would like to live and coexist together peacefully.
Thank you, Kamal.
Thank
Philip?
you.
Sure. So the economy is not really my focus, but I'll try to answer as far as I can. I agree with Kamal that the ball proverbially is on the Azerbaijani side, and extending the hand is important from that side. But this is also just as important for the Armenian side to accept a hand that is extended. And a lot depends in that sense of what's happening right now within Armenia, and we have two discourses fighting each other out. Yes, a more revanchist one and a more pragmatic, and the one for re-engaging with Azerbaijan and Turkey on constructive terms. And on the positive end, that discourse, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, at least professional lifetime, has a voice. I haven't heard it in any public a mainstream way, I would say, for at least 20 years. So now it is making a comeback, and we do, for pragmatic reasons perhaps, it is getting a second look from the Armenian population. So I do see a chance for the discourse for prevailing. So that's an important part. On the more specific economic terms, though, what's happening on the ground is important. And one of the provisions in that November 9 document is the opening of communication and the roads to Nakhchivan, keeping the Lachin road open for Armenians. And it is right now being treated as a threat as opposed to an opportunity, and that's very unfortunate, particularly the Nakhchivan road for Armenians, but also on the Azerbaijani end. How are we opening further communications if even the Lachin road is right now contested and Armenians are supposed to build a new road going around Shushi or Shusha, however you want to call it, if we are talking about open borders and open communication lines. So perhaps let's start from the ones that already exist. Yeah, try not to close this to each other and put roads that go around each other as opposed to being exploited jointly. And on that, we can build also potential for future steps. So essentially smaller steps, the ones that are possible right now, first of all, goodwill gestures also outside of the roads, such as exchange of prisoners, but also allowing each other to exploit the existing roads. And from there on, we can hopefully build to a place where also railroad communication and other communication can become possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My next question is to Gerard. There are a lot of questions in the chat about Nikol Pashinyan's political future in Armenia and whether or not he will, the extent to which he will suffer, or I mean, obviously there's already protests against him in Armenia. Do you think that he will be prime minister after this for much longer? And if so, how do you foresee his political future? And if not, who are likely, who are those who are likely to come after him? And what do you think their approach to this conflict resolution will be?
Thank you, Julie. If you'll permit me, I'd like to spend a minute responding to the question regarding economy.
Of course, please.
Economic benefits. This is a very important area, but I think it will not mean much if there's no change in mental and political attitudes in Azerbaijan. That is, let me begin with the peace pipeline. Most of you are too young to remember that when the pipeline was going to be built, Baku-Ceyhan, in the 1990s, it was proposed that it go through Armenia in return for Armenia giving up its position on Karabakh as the peace pipeline. And all the economic benefits were presented, and the international community in Azerbaijan didn't understand that there's something much more serious here than economic benefits. And now, we need to go to the fundamental, and that is for any Armenian to want to benefit or to see the benefits of economic development above the political and identity issues, Azerbaijan will have to stop thinking in terms of domination of Armenians as opposed to governance. This has been a serious problem from the beginning. You'll remember that Azerbaijan, when the conflict started, a political conflict, Azerbaijan did not respond by negotiating. It responded by bombing Stepanakert. It responded by blockading it. And since then, we have not seen Azerbaijan trying to reach out to the leadership of Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. This is fundamental. That is, it was necessary to subdue Armenians, to dominate them. And once we dominate them now we talk about economic development, now we talk about peace and other issues. What I'm trying to say with regard to economy is that it will not be possible to use the economic benefits in the service of peace unless the president of Azerbaijan stops calling Armenians dogs that will be chased. Okay? It will be impossible to convince Armenians that there's sincerity in the wish for peace and communications and all of that. All the communications will be seen as foreign imposed and as the result of defeat, which will be difficult to capitalize on. Now, with regard to the question of Pashinyan, it is very uncertain what will happen. I think there are a couple of issues here. One is that the main one, I think, is let's suppose Pashinyan resigns today. Who comes to take his place? If it's done constitutionally, then it is maybe another leader of the My Step political party that has the majority in parliament. If you go with the street demonstrators and parties that have come together demanding his resignation, then you go with, in this case, Vasken Manukyan, who is an old horse. And the main problem with them is that these are the parties that did not want any solution to the conflict except for war. They did not think that they needed to make compromises. I don't see, and many people do not see, how this change can take place if the replacement is someone who represents not only the old guard, but also the oligarchs, those who have cheated the elections, those who have made millions, if not billions, and now want to escape the consequences. So this is not just a battle for Pashinyan going, but also saying who will come in return. If it's done peacefully, if it's done constitutionally, then there should be at some point new parliamentary special elections, and then people will decide who does it, who continues, and Pashinyan may win again or may lose. And then it will be possible to say who is in charge. But I think there's quite a bit of uncertainty, particularly when the opposition in the street is not excluding the possibility of non-constitutional means, not just civil disobedience. So I cannot say, I don't think anyone can say what will happen under these circumstances when there are so many unknowns. Pashinyan was in Gyumri yesterday, the second largest city, and people were coming to him, and I don't think it was staged, and saying, please don't resign, otherwise these wolves will come back and eat us again. That is the old guard. But overall, I would say I would be very concerned if Pashinyan is replaced, and replaced with someone who is also equally responsible for the kind of mentality that was based on illusions, on misunderstanding Azerbaijan, on misunderstanding the international community, because they will come back with the kind of revanchism that will get Armenia nowhere. So I think the answer is I don't know. But these are the issues that I would take into consideration.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. There are a number of questions about if you guys can imagine the lived reality for those who are returning, or the civilians that are relocating, especially the Azerbaijani citizens that are relocating into the territories and into Karabakh proper. The reality, of course, is then you have two civilian communities who have suffered the horrors of war and have a long memory and their own kind of exclusive narratives about that memory and what the war means. Zaur, I'm going to ask you to speak first on this, but I'm curious to know if you can imagine any trust building nature, or what are your expectations in terms of these sorts of civilian interactions, of the lived reality for the people who will be there in the near future.
Thank you for question. I think before that, I would like to just a small remark about this the economic prosperity and opening the borders with Turkey. I think this opening the borders with Armenia is a prospect that can help improve the Armenia-Turkish ties, but it will take time. This can only happen after a cool down period. So right now, I think it's very early to talk about this very positive effect of the opening the border. But in the meantime, in the future, in the near future, we will see this positive effect. So coming to the question about this, how this coexistence of the Azerbaijan and Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh and this region, I think that the first of all, there is a one thing that it was called the Red Queen race. It's the things that you are constantly running but remaining in the same spot, and the advice is that if you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as that. So I mean it applies to the conflict related to the situation, and it applies to the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. And if you like to move the fast and to see this improvement of the relationship, first of all there should be some there are many announced about the deal, especially when it comes to governance, self-governance, and the role of the peacekeepers, and how possible the return of the IDPs to their homes. Because this agreement, the trilateral agreement, stipulates also the return of the Azerbaijanis to Nagorno-Karabakh itself, not only to Shusha, also to other areas. So, and how it's going to manage and how it's going to happen. So this is the first question. And then I think there will be the Azerbaijan IDPs a little bit traumatized before, but also right now we see much more trauma because they see that destruction of their homes and the houses, and they were a lack of awareness of this the scale of the destruction in these the areas. And in our imagination, the possible destruction we saw in the 2000s on Agdam, it was called the ghost town, but right now we see that in many areas there's a similar situation. So it can also this cannot make the very good sense of the for Azerbaijan, a very good starting point. But in the meantime, the main question will be whether there will be new dividing lines and the crossroads, the roads, and I think that the agreement stipulates that there will be different roads for Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians and Azerbaijan to live in Nagorno-Karabakh. So that's why my concern is that it can become a new dividing alliance before Azerbaijan and Armenians to start talking to each other and to find a way how they can deal with each other. But I think this is there is a prospect and there is a good opportunity to start not in the next might be 6 months or the 1 year, but in the meantime in the near future we will see to coexistence of Azerbaijan and Armenians. And so it's possible. No one can ignore this, but there should be a Red Queen race, I will call it. So we should be fast as much as twice if you would like to move from the one point to another point.
Thank you. Philip, I wonder if you have some comments?
Sure. So for the conflict to be solved in any sustainable sense, of course, Armenians and Azerbaijanis will have to eventually live together, return, and be able to coexist. The way the relationship was developing in the past 30, maybe more years, unfortunately, points in opposite direction. So when you have Armenians and Azerbaijanis in the same place, it seemed to create violence rather than peace. So that equation has to be somehow changed for return to be possible, even in territories that are controlled by right now by one side or the other, because all of this still remains a volatile war zone, effectively. And if the violence is to restart, the civilian population is immediately gets targeted. Unfortunately, as we've seen in this war. Neither side is particularly interested in following Geneva Conventions on somehow safeguarding the civilian populations. They are seen as a very legitimate target, which is something that, again, in the future should be ruled out. So for me, in my view, to see a possibility of coexistence of everybody returning to their homes, there should be a bigger mechanism. I will get back to my original point of transitional justice put in place, where very intentionally and in a very systematic way, the war crimes of the past, all the wrong done to those displaced in the past and currently, all the violence committed towards civilians and in violation of Geneva Convention right now are addressed, as well as all the rhetoric, including in issues like textbooks and the way we run commemorations are addressed. There is so much really hatred built on a very institutional state level towards each other. And here I won't single out only Azerbaijan. I say the same thing is happening in Armenia. There is so much hatred and enemy image built in regard to each other that any kind of coexistence right now in that environment, institutional environment of hatred, is a recipe for essentially violence, potentially of civilians against civilians or governments against civilians. So if we are to have a next stage of a peace process, which I hope we will, the transitional justice and institutional changes that make coexistence possible, and minority rights, especially of the rights of those who have been seen formerly as the enemies, the Armenians in Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is in Armenian controlled territories. They are not treated anymore as enemies of the state, but are treated as equal citizens. So that's an extremely important step before we can really think about any serious physical coexistence.
Thank you so much, Philip. Just some points on the Q&A that coming up. There are a number of questions that are, from my estimation or my interpretation, seeking to want our panelists to embrace a particular political narrative and to kind of protect their objectivity, and also to I've been tasked with keeping these basic 4 parameters that we started off our discussion with. I'm just going to apologize right now, and I'm not necessarily going to give voice to those, but I presume that you'll have an opportunity to give voice to them in other venues other than this one. So I am seeing them, I am reading them, but sometimes they're hard for me to package without forcing our panelists to embrace a political narrative, and they're here as scientists first and foremost. So just to clarify that for you in my process, and I apologize for that, but I think it's necessary. I wanted to ask a question, and Kamal, I'm going to ask you this question first. A number of questions have come up with about Russian neutrality or Russia's role in this, as an interlocutor with peace, and how that role has changed from the 1994 ceasefire into the current day. Kamal, I'm going to ask you to speak on this first, and then Gerard, I was going to ask you to weigh in, given your your history with this. I'm reminded of Philip's comments, or was it Zaur who said anyone who is as white-haired as Professor Libaridian, but there we have it. But Kamal, I wonder if you could comment first on what is the role of Russia, and do you think they'll leave after 5 years, or is there a longer-term mission in the region here?
Thank you very much, Julie. I would first like to quickly address the humanitarian field as well. Just on the side note, I do understand that the conflict also carries a lot of humanitarian issues and human dimension in it. I really do. And I also specialize in international humanitarian law, and I understand the complexity of the situation. Also rhetoric, also all that negative that is associated with the conflict. But I also would like to attract your attention to the fact that we have a temporal zone of 5 years, first and foremost, with a ceasefire agreement, and concentrating on something that is realistic to achieve in those 5 years, something that requires a very low level political will and effort, first and foremost. And that's why I'm thinking about the economy and the communications first and foremost, that realizable transitional justice and the questions of a peaceful coexistence, track 2, they take a lot of time, years and maybe decades, to overcome those kind of intrinsic problems, as rightly stated. So they are going to be important, but in the longer term, view for sure. But these 5 years that we have, they need to be used to the maximum degree possible, including the track 2 and track 1.5 and all of that as well. When it comes to the role of Russia, of course, first and foremost, it has to be pointed out that the agreement or the statement, as Russian officials call it, have been reached with direct mediation of Russia, direct involvement in the diplomacy and negotiations with both sides to reach such an agreement. But they also right now are the most important part, play the most important part in the enforcement mechanism, because it's their peacekeepers there on the ground. And as far as I understand and know from the reports from media, the peacekeeping mission proceeding there very rapidly. It has been engaged and is growing very rapidly. And at the same time, they were able to maintain the peaceful situation. So with a very, very low and not intensive domestic violations of sorts, not even measurable on a larger scale of any kind of hostility. So there's, apart from very little hiccups, they've been largely successful to keep peace. And the role of Russia with that, of course, is growing in for both Azerbaijan and Armenia, especially within the parameters of the agreement that is right now just started to its first 5-year term, with the possibility of a prolongation for another 5 years, and so indefinitely until one of the sides is going to object. But as pointed out, calling the agreement a statement from the Russian side is also a very, very interesting question to discuss as to why such a low level of legal implications is included in the labeling of the agreement. What is their own reason behind that? Is it just the formality that because it was called initially so it's there, or is it something larger in terms of the Russian thinking about the agreement and understanding the situation on the ground there, and the way they are thinking outside maybe the 5-year temporal zone that the agreement is covering initially. There's also a clear understanding of the role of Russia in terms of the future mediator for further practicalities associated with the conflict, and we see it already. Not everything is detailed. It's not a very detailed legal document, and many practicalities associated with its 9 points that are reflected in the agreement have been already there on the table in front of the parties, and the Russians and the Russian military were there to basically serve as a mediating conduit for the talks between Azerbaijan and Armenia regarding those practicalities. Exchange of prisoners, maintenance of the corridors, the Lachin corridor, and how the positions of the Russian peacekeepers are located and what they are demarcating in terms of a line of contact, if it can be called like this anymore, etc., etc. So the role of Russia is, of course, going to be very, very large and continuing to be large with the enveloping of these 9 points that we have in this agreement.
Professor Libaridian, what are your thoughts?
Well, let me begin with a comment on the statement which Kamal has aptly described. I'm not sure what it means. Legally, of course, Kamal is better equipped to describe it than I am, but I think I look at it as a political statement as much as it is a legal statement. That means that the parties and that control the statement, not necessarily the ones that signed it, the parties that control the statement will interpret it as they want. And here the main interpreters will be Russia and Azerbaijan, not so much the Armenian side. even treaties are interpreted. And therefore, particularly with a statement like this, where you have so many moving parts, this is a typical statement or agreement that ends a very difficult war and a very difficult situation in a very complex conflict. So there are many moving parts, and these moving parts will be determined by what actually happens. One of which is, are there enough Armenians who return to what is left of Karabakh in order to justify peacekeeping forces? Now, going to the Russian angle, some things have changed, but there are a couple of things that are very steady as far as Russia is concerned. Number one, they don't want the South Caucasus to become so full of upheavals that it will endanger Russia's southern border, that is the North Caucasus republics. But the more important one, and one that will ensure that the first doesn't happen, is Russia has tried since the collapse of the Soviet Union to try to make sure that South Caucasus doesn't go under the influence of the West. This is very simple geopolitics. And for them, the management of the Karabakh conflict is directed by this principle. And if in the 90s, and 20 years ago, 15 years ago, it was the Minsk group, now they've decided that the time has come to do a Russian deal. And that is so important, again, that the South Caucasus doesn't go to the West. And so they've been able to do it with this statement. So that part of it is extremely important, that it's not a Minsk group agreement, number one. Number two, it's a deal with Azerbaijan, not with Armenia. But the Armenian side has looked upon it as a security guarantee for Armenians who are there or will return. But fundamentally, it's between Azerbaijan and Russia. And Russia is now there in the three republics of the South Caucasus militarily. It has a base in Armenia, it has Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and now it has basically what remains of Karabakh. So whether this interest will wane or not, I don't know. It's not clear to me anyway. I don't know if it's clear to others, to the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan, or whether it is very clear to the leaders of Russia as to what is their end game, other than making sure the West is not there. That is, do they intend to kind of use the enclave of Karabakh as a permanent situation, or to make sure that minimally the West stays out? Do they intend to possibly recreate a modem of an empire again, or imperial rule, while the three republics are there, but still controlling them? Or is it just to keep the others out, which would require maybe a minimal presence? But I can imagine that in case of another conflict, that is, if the right steps are not taken by Azerbaijan, by Armenians, by Armenia, then, as our colleagues have indicated, there is the possibility of a renewed confrontation, but I don't see that as very, very likely. But in case there is one, then Azerbaijan can insist on Russians leaving, and that would then compel Russia to decide whether they do or not. And if they don't, will Azerbaijan then call upon Turkey again to come and provide some assistance, which means now a very, very big war. So I don't think Russia wants to get into another war, but I think it is the possibility of a maximal presence and control than as opposed to a minimal presence and management. Let me mention something. In '93, when I was both Deputy Foreign Minister and advisor to the President, and I was representing Armenia in the Minsk group, I did a study with my staff on what does Russia want? Because at that time, Russia was a member of the Minsk group. So Minsk group proposals had Russia's approval at the same time as Russia was bringing its own initiatives for peace directly and secretly. And there were a number of these initiatives that happened. And my staff studied it, and I said, what is common to all these? Minsk group proposals, Russian proposals, and the answer was from my staff, control of Lachin. That was the answer, that all these proposals had one thing in common. The other parts were moving, could change. But of course, the other part was Russia never wanted to deal with the status issue. That was also common, but it was never in the documents, the status issue, because if Russia made a statement on the status issue, it would either antagonize Armenia or Azerbaijan. So not deciding on the status issue, and it was difficult to decide anyway, made it a minimally acceptable mediator. So I think there's the continuity in Russian policy on the higher level of not allowing the West to come in and therefore to go in itself, at the same time on the tactical level of doing so by controlling Lachin. So there has been,
oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm going. Yeah, it's okay.
I'm so sorry. Zaur, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, I think that many people actually ask about whether Russia is going to leave or not after 5 years, and this is a very serious concern in Azerbaijan, especially the deployment of the Russian forces is a serious security concern, and also people are unhappy. But if we concentrate on this, whether and when the Russian peacekeepers will leave, then I think we will lose the next 5 years. So I think there are many important issues that Azerbaijan is going to face, especially the rebuilding and repopulating the region. So that's why the focus should be to these issues. But what we need right now is that to clarifying the mandate of the Russian peacekeepers. What's the tasks? Is it only just to monitoring the situation, or whether they have for example, demilitarize the region, whether they have a right to communication between the sides? So there are many questions that we don't have an answer, and therefore we need a checks and balance for Russian peacekeepers. So checks and balance can come only with the deployment of some civilian mission to the region. Might be UN mediated or OIC mediated. So then I think we will have a much more clarity, at least assurance that Russia will behave in accordance with the statement. But the question is that whether they are going to live after 5 years. I think the professor answered this, but my answer will be that I think the Mikhail Zhvanetsky once brilliantly stated that Russia is a country with unpredictable past. So Russia periodically revises her past, and every time she does that, it affects her neighbors too. So I don't know when, after 5 years, when the Russia is going to revise its past, what will be their perception. So it's very hard to answer right now whether they are going to leave or not. But I think this will be on the also hands of the Azerbaijan and Armenia, whether they will achieve the peace or not after 5 years.
Thank you so much, Zaur. Philip, I wonder, there are a number of questions in the queue here about the role of the Armenian diaspora, both in regard to kind of framing the narrative of the most recent outbreak of events, but also in terms of establishing policy for kind of status in the end for for Karabakh. I'm curious if you could comment a little bit about your observations.
If I can, let me start, go back to the Russia question for a second, and then I'll move to the diaspora question. I agree with Professor Libaridian and that the main role was to keep, or maybe even remove the West as far as possible from the South Caucasus. That is the goal that has been currently achieved through a tactical alliance with Turkey. But the question is for how long, right? So what will happen with the new US administration? What will happen down the road with new US and possibly Russian administrations? So considering all of that, I doubt, and there is no recent precedent for Russia removing its forces from any region once they are already there. So I see it very, very unlikely that in 5 years we will see a Russian withdrawal. Irrespective of that, yes, I fully agree with Zaur Shiriyev also that the collaboration between Armenia and Azerbaijan is important for these two countries to be able to maximize their own control over their own future, in a way irrespective almost of what are the other bigger powers and their politics, because they can continually change. Coming to the diaspora question, I would say that it's an important question to ask and doesn't have a particularly interesting answer, frankly. I think the role of diasporas is exaggerated. Perhaps when it comes to the genocide, Armenian genocide recognition issue, in that one case, diaspora has a stronger voice, especially Armenian diaspora, and more of an kind of proactive role to play. When it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh question, I've for 30 years have seen diaspora follow and support the Armenian policies, but never set Armenian policies in any meaningful sense. So yes, it will do fundraising, it will do lobbying in Congress, American Congress, or in France, or wherever possible, to solicit some statements. But as a leading force, it's hard to see. It never really was the case, especially not under the current administration of Pashinyan. It hardly listened to advice, let alone any kind of pressure from the diaspora. So
thank you so
much.
much.
Not exaggerate that role. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There's a question. There are a number of questions. I just want to say we're at 1:30. We have 30 more minutes, but some of our panelists need to leave a little bit early. So I'm going to ask one more kind of specific question, and then I'm going to go to some general questions to ask all the panelists to weigh in on. My specific question is to Kamal, and it is about different tracks of diplomacy and the best way you think the path is going forward to actually bring about real results. There's a question which hopefully you'll provide some context on about the differentiation between the potentials for track 1.5 diplomacy versus track 3 diplomacy. I wonder if you can give us maybe a 30-second tutorial about what those things actually mean, and then what your insights are for kind of the next concrete paths forward that might bring about some effective outcomes.
Thanks a lot, Julie. I want to stress that I'm not a specific specialist in the certain tracks of diplomacy per se, but I'm quite aware and participated in some of the efforts even before that have been there during the past 20 years of this continuous conflict. The main distinction that we would see that track to diplomacy or people-to-people context or people-to-people diplomacy, civil society cooperation is, as I said, going to be a longer-term solution and longer-term project, which doesn't mean that it shouldn't start running as soon as possible. The same can be said about other tracks of the diplomacy, because they all have added value in the end. Track 1.5 is a combination of government officials and representatives of civil society. Same goes to the track 3. My main concern is that restarting track 1 diplomacy, or the intergovernmental diplomacy, is actually would be most challenging in the coming in the nearest future because of the challenges that are now faced inside the political situation in Armenia. But that restart of this first track of diplomacy is going to be crucial for addressing the shortcomings that we have as much as possible. And then, of course, the other track of diplomacy running in parallel are the most effective combination, because you have to have all of them there to add value to the overall positive dynamics for the conflict resolution. What I would also point out is that it is true that first and the 1.5 track diplomacy actually can have, given the political will, quick short-term effect. But when you go beyond the first track, first and foremost, farther into the track 1.5, 2, and 3, the farther you get from this track 1, the longer term the project becomes. And even already on track 1.5, you would have to have a very concrete, from both sides, have a very concrete setup and differentiation between the governmental representative and representative of civil society there participating, and have a very clear roles delineated for them to be able to be effective. And that have proven to be, even before, quite a challenge for both Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the representative from both sides. So at some point, there's going to be a question of how all these tracks work together and add value, but restarting track 1, in my humble opinion, is going to be a first and foremost priority. And of course, the stabilization of political situation in Armenia, and then also steps taken and pointed out by many panelists here already from Azerbaijan, are going to be crucial for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamal. Philip?
The question was about the democratization and its role, right, in the future?
No. We're on different kinds of tracks of diplomacy, 1.5 versus 3, 2.
All right, I will still go to democratization for a minute, because I feel like it's connected. I cannot disconnect the democratization from civil society track. So it's important to remember that we don't live anymore in the 90s. And this is where I think Armenian revolution was mistimed, right? So it was like a decade or 2 decades late. And that was something that unfortunately the Pashinyan government, I think, didn't take into consideration, expecting much more international support that it received. The way Saakashvili government received in 2003 or Baltic states received in 1990s simply was not possible in late 2010s. And the world overall had moved, unfortunately, perhaps, but moved away from the liberal democratic model, and support for it wasn't present. So considering that, I think the return to, again, 90s style liberal democratization, at least in the current environment, isn't possible. And that in turn signals difficulties that civil society engagement, again, in the style of 1990s, will face. Having said that, I think a degree of democratization, a degree of specifically focused on minority rights, and allowing essentially from the governments not to fully monopolize this process, and allow for track 2 and confidence building measures and civil society support for issues such as, again, transitional justice, such as reintegration, such as coexistence, such as addressing the issues of missing persons and war crimes, to be had, again, simply for the necessity of building a region where these 2 groups can coexist. Because in the current situation where we have extremely illiberal state in Azerbaijan and in Armenia that is moving in that direction, either under Pashinyan or some of the possible alternative, also going in a very kind of militarized, revanchist, and also disregarding the rights of Azerbaijanis, let's say, version. In that scenario, we will have no possibility simply to coexist. So again, while I don't see a full 1990s engagement of civil society possible, some collaboration between track 2 actors and the governments are necessary, particularly for advancing minority rights that can make coexistence possible. And sorry, one last sentence here. I think that in that case, European Union particularly, but also the United States have a role to play, because it was their disengagement, one of the main factors where really all the track 2 efforts really fell apart, or where became extremely marginal, and really this only power politics became the only possibility that we are facing right now. So if that continues, I don't see any good future for this region, but the engagement of the maybe softer engagement than before of the United States and European Union is necessary for balancing out not only Russia and Turkey in general in the region, but specifically balancing out the kind of politics that we are seeing on the ground.
There are a number of questions in the Q&A that have raised issues of status, and with regard to status, and I know status is a kind of a dangerous place for us to engage in, and I don't necessarily want you guys to speak on that unless you have an opinion that that's kind of settled. But there is the issue, of course, on what any kind of autonomy would be, or if there is a possibility for any kind of autonomy for any Armenian civilians that live in the Karabakh territory, and what that might mean, and how they might be able to maintain some kind of security if the status condition falls within the political framework of Azerbaijan. Zaur, I wonder if you might softly speak to this and any of the other issues, of course, that we've discussed on the diplomacy issues. But I'm curious how you might weigh in on the considerations for Armenian civilians on the ground.
Thank you. I think the Azerbaijani side always talk about the high-level autonomy to Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians before the war, but despite we didn't see any paper about this, but we also collected some ideas how it will look like. For example, there were some models that look like the same, but right now we are. This is not going to be a case in the future talks. So I think that right now Azerbaijan position is that the maximum we can offer the cultural autonomy, so specifically how it could look like, it's very early to talk. So first of all, I think that this should be held. This discussion should happen between Nagorno-Karabakh Azerbaijanis and Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians. So they will first decide the fate of their future. But one thing is clear: its Azerbaijan position is that it should be happening under the Azerbaijani territorial integrity. But therefore, if there will be the phase to the negotiation, I think there will be ways of finding dealing with the security issues, how to make us secure and feel secure. But before that, I think moving to this point status, there should be a cohabitation, coexistence, and they should understand how they can live, and they should live the side by side. So that's why I think the first period should be about this the coexistence period. So then I think it will be easier. It will be much more easier than today to talk about and to think about the future of the status issue. And probably in the next 5 years, there will be non-status the region under the Russian peacekeeping protection. So, but until that time, I think we will envision the future how we see it is. But also there is one particular question addressed to me. I don't want to leave this question. The question is about this the Geneva Convention and how. What's my opinion about Human Rights Watch report about Armenian war prisoners being inhumanly tortured by Azerbaijanis? So there's one fundamental problem between Azerbaijan and Armenians, and because often we like to show other sides torture, other sides what other sides did to us. So, and this is a very fundamental problem. So then we try to say that if, but So they also did this. So in order to leave this rhetoric, this psychology, we need to have some transitional justice, the period between Azerbaijan and Armenians, and it should be include also that the status or what happened, violation of the Geneva Convention about the torturing of the soldiers, but also it should include also the civilians population. So the civilian population killed during this war, and their issue also should be bring to this issue. So, and also there is a missing people and returnees. As far as I know, there are more than 4,000 Azerbaijan and Armenians is missing from the first war, and some of them are identified. So one of the way of the reconciliation of the return of the missing people, if the Red Cross identified them, then to have some commission, joint commission, to find out the mistreatment and also discussing all of these issues happen to civilians and also the military men and violation of the Geneva Convention. So this should be a very internationally how to support the process. Despite Azerbaijan started this investigation, but there should be much more international involvement to this issue in order to make both Azerbaijan and Armenians to believe to the process. Otherwise, they will say this is a propaganda.
All right. Thank you so much. Philip, I know that you have to leave soon. I was curious, though, before you went, if you could give us your thoughts on this question.
On the status, well, I do, if we are to move towards normalization, if we are to move towards a place where we can really coexist, I think the military victory, and I agree with this also, by the way, prior to this war, that military victory should not be the one deciding everything, at least everything. And in this case, the status of Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and self-rule has been really the contention point here, and it remains, both for the region in general, but also for the wider world and really for the precedent it is setting. So I do believe that the status, at least in the form of an autonomy, should remain on the table and be granted if we are to have a kind of positive relationship moving forward. And I believe I already did answer about the issue of democratization, where I do believe that a greater engagement of the European Union and United States is necessary to maintain some degree of democratization, which in turn is a very important point that is necessary for re-engagement of these two societies in a constructive dialogue. And thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation, and I do apologize for having to drop out earlier.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you. Gerard, I wonder if I could ask you this question about the role of status and the role of, just broader democratization in the region. How important do you think regime is for the continuation of real conflict resolution, for the potentiality of real conflict resolution?
Well, thank you. I don't have as much trust in the value of democratization for conflict resolution, because we have seen that often peace is made by dictators and not necessarily democrats, such as in Egypt, when Sadat, a dictator, made peace with Israel, and had it been a very democratic government representing the Egyptian people, no such peace could have been made. Now, there's too much value placed on democratization, and I do not have too much hope for it, certainly not for Azerbaijan in as far as I can see at this point. The experimentation in Azerbaijan with democratization was early, and I've also maintained that often, given the propaganda and television and textbooks that are used in Azerbaijan, I think President Gerard Aliyev was more flexible than his people. And Ilham Aliyev I think early on was more open than the Azerbaijani people. If they had elected a nationalist, I don't think it would have been much better than what President Aliyev did. As far as the, and I don't think, maybe I'm being too brutal or cynical, but I don't think that the US or Europe, particularly the US, they don't care much about democracy. That's not how they decide how to relate to a region, to a conflict, or to a country. That's not the basis of relations. Otherwise, the West should have supported Armenia as opposed to basically agreeing with Azerbaijan on the two most important things, that Karabakh will not be independent and that the district must be returned, and then we can talk about the status. So I don't really have that much trust in democracy solving a problem. Now, with regard to the status, I will be brief. It's very difficult to talk about it, but the way Zaur presented it, I think it will be a non-starter for Armenians. That is imposing all of Azerbaijan's agenda on the Armenians. The big question in my mind is now whether, assuming that the Russians will allow something else to happen there other than the status that is there today, an enclave under their control, the big question is whether there will be a willingness on the part of Azerbaijan to have a territorially designated Karabakh to begin with, as opposed to what President Ilham Aliyev is talking about, a culturally defined kind of identity-based and not politically based Karabakh. So if there's no such possibility, that means that Azerbaijan is not really negotiating, Azerbaijan is not really giving a way out, Azerbaijan is not really recognizing that Armenians as a collective entity have any kind of rights in Azerbaijan. So this is the difference. Now, whether Azerbaijan can move from there to somewhere where they can accept a territorially defined entity with whom you have sat down and discussed, I don't think there will be much of a solution. I want to say something, Julie, about what Zaur, I think, has been talking about. That is, and you talked about and defined it as exclusive narratives. And this is a very important thing. And Zaur, I think Kamal has mentioned some solutions, but I would say that there are events which one side remembers and the other doesn't. For example, in 1999, when I was doing research for a book on this subject, when I talked to Azerbaijanis, they mentioned Khojalı, the killing of Azerbaijanis in a village within Azerbaijan. When I talked to Armenians, they never mentioned that. And they mentioned the Sumgait pogroms that were in 1988, 3 years before, 4 years before before Khojalı. And now, you know, Zaur mentions the killing of a general during time of conflict, right? The major general, I think, was his rank in April of 2016. But we don't mention the fact that during peacetime in Hungary, an Azerbaijani officer hacked to death a sleeping Armenian officer. Now that might be ascribed to an individual revenge, but that officer was made into a national hero, given a higher rank in the military, given an apartment and money, and was made a national hero. So Armenians will remember that, and that's preceded by a few years. So the important thing is now before larger transitional justice and stuff. I think there has to be a conscious decision by the leaders of the two peoples, the two countries. There has to be a conscious decision that this is a problem. Otherwise, no justice, no international commission will be helpful. There has to be a realization that we don't recognize what we've done to the other. And this is on a human level. This is on the level of political parties. This is on the level of religious leaders. This is on the level of certainly political and educational leaders to say that, first of all, I have my narrative, but maybe there's another narrative I should be aware of.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Gerard. Kamal, I wonder if I could give you the last word, given that we have about 4 minutes left, to talk about this exclusive narrative issue, or maybe the status issue, the ones you think are most relevant in our final 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I think that first and foremost, I would separate those two dimensions, the political military dimension that we're facing right now, and the human dimension, humanitarian dimension, as much as possible, because if we are going to connect them, and we're going to be stuck in these two mutually exclusive narratives, and we're going to be tying the issues that actually lie outside the human and humanitarian dimensions to a very painful situation that is occurring in the human and humanitarian dimension, and is also being only multiplied exponentially by the hostilities and by the results of the hostilities. Concentrating on that would basically feed the nationalistic narratives on both sides, and then would transform this into the political decisions that are not thought through from the point of view of pragmatism, from the point of view of establishing long-lasting peace. They are going to be thought through this emotional response to the violence and to the injustice committed to both sides. And if this is going to be always tied into the political process and into the political military process and then to the peace process, we are going to arrive into the situation where we're going to be stuck in this infinite loop of these two mutually exclusive narratives that would going to be lack awareness, not only of one another, but awareness of the ways forward that we can enact now and in the short-term period of time. So I would say that if those two are going to be tied together and not addressed in parallel, it's going to be counterproductive for the peace process, and it's going to mark another era of lost opportunities for long-lasting peace. That would be all for me. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have reached the final minute, and this has been a very good and I would say balanced discussion in a highly challenging situation. And we would like, of course, to thank the panelists for their key addresses and comments, and of course all participants for input and questions. There are 99 questions. It has been quite amazing that we have been having a discussion spanning from the Caucasus all the way over Europe to California. Julie, thank you for being such a wise and great moderator. And finally, special thanks to Kamal for putting this together, for all your efforts for us to be together today for this discussion. So with these words, I would like to end our session. We have no virtual bouquet of flowers, unfortunately, but again, thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Nice seeing you again, Zaur.
Thank you. Same here.
Take care. Yeah. And Julie, thank you very much. This was wonderful. Nice meeting you, Kamal, finally.
very
And
much.
Karina, thanks for the whole event.
Thanks for joining us, really.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.